John Edwards Jones grew up in a lively household with 6 siblings. His dad was the one who introduced him and his brother Josh to the art of exploring caves. At first, crawling around in dark, tight spaces seemed pretty intimidating, but it didn't take long for them to find the thrill in it. The 2 brothers spent most of their childhood diving into every cave they could find across Utah, losing track of time and getting lost in the adventure. But life had a way of changing things up. By the time John was 26, he was a husband with a 1-year-old daughter and another baby on the way. To top it all off, he had packed up and moved to Virginia to attend medical school, where he was studying to become a pediatric cardiologist. With all these new responsibilities piling up, family, school, future career, John found himself drifting away from his pastime he had loved so much as a kid, and he wasn't really happy about it. That longing, however, wouldn't last forever. November 2009 rolled around, and Jones headed back to Utah for Thanksgiving to catch up with his family. During his big reunion, he decided it was a perfect time to dive back into his old childhood hobby, but there was no way he was going to do it without his old caving buddy, so he roped his older brother Josh into the plan too. Now with all the excitement and determination brewing, the task was to pick the right spot for their epic return to spelunking. It had to be wild and packed with adrenaline, something that would really mark their comeback. And in Utah there was only one cave that fit that description perfectly, the Nutty Putty. Located just west of Utah Lake, it's a 145-foot deep hydrothermal abyss known for its winding paths and super tight squeezes. This reputation made it a must-visit spot for spelunkers and cave enthusiasts from all over the world. At one point, it was pulling in over 5,000 visitors a year, but with no real system in place to monitor who was going in and out, plenty of folks would end up heading into the cave late at night without taking the proper safety precautions. Besides that, the heavy foot traffic had worn down the rock inside the cave, making the already narrow passages dangerously slippery. By 2006, authorities were raising red flags, saying a part of the cave known as the Big Slide, with its 45-degree angle, wasn't safe to enter anymore. After a couple of scary incidents where people got stuck, they decided to shut it down for a while, putting a gate at the entrance to keep people out. Fast forward 3 years, and they decided to reopen it, completely unaware that something far more terrifying was going to happen. Every section of the Nutty Putty Cave had a distinctive name, each with its own story. Some were named after shapes that looked like human organs, like the birth canal. Others, such as the Scout-Eater, alluded to the cave's notorious history. Meanwhile, there were those that were hinted at just how tough it was to get through, like the maze and the Big Slide. The Big Slide was the cave's largest section and of course incredibly slick, but the birth canal was something else entirely. Cavers who made it there described it as a ridiculously tight squeeze that just got narrower and narrower the deeper you went, and then finally it opened up into a larger space, giving you this strange feeling of being born all over again. It sounded exactly like the kind of thrill John and Josh were after. So on November 24th of 2009, bright and early, the 2 of them, along with 10 friends and family members, wriggled their way into the Nutty Putty Cave. They started by checking out the Big Slide, but their main goal was to tackle the birth canal. Splitting into 2 groups, the rest of the family kept doing their thing, while John went solo to find the canal. After a while of searching, he finally stumbled upon a narrow squeeze. Thinking it might lead him to the birth canal, he decided to crawl through it. A few minutes in, he spotted a hole in the wall that looked just like what he'd read about at the canal's entrance. Even though he wasn't entirely sure, something inside him told him to go for it. So trusting his gut, he plunged in headfirst. As he moved forward, he kept hoping the squeeze would open up into the birth canal, but instead, it was just getting tighter. It was like hitting a brick wall, but the weird part was he had no idea what was going on. The tightness should have freaked anyone out, but he was on a high from the adventure, treating it like some kind of thrilling challenge instead of a terrifying ordeal. He crawled for what felt like ages, but the squeeze never seemed to give. With each inch, he lost all sense of direction. At one point, he did enter the birth canal, but somewhere along the way, veered off unknowingly and ended up in a totally different section, the Scout-Eater. That passage was never meant for exploring. It was just way too tight for anyone to navigate, hence the deadly name. Eventually, he came to a sharp, almost vertical drop. He was buzzing with excitement, thinking this might be the spot in the birth canal that would open up to a big, spacious area, but once again, he was wrong. Unaware of the trouble ahead, he continued down the tunnel, which was now so tight it barely measured 10 inches by 18 inches. Then out of nowhere, reality hit him like a freight train. Instead of discovering an open chamber, he found himself face to face with a dead end. The narrow passage had led him to a point of no return, and he was stuck upside down. Panicking, he tried to push himself back through the hole, but lost his grip and fell into it. He called for help, and his brother Josh came to see what was wrong. When Josh arrived, he tried to pull John up by the legs, making some headway, but then he slipped from Josh's grasp and slid back into the crevice. This time even tighter, with one hand pinned beneath him and the other twisted awkwardly behind him. Realizing the gravity of the situation, he and Josh quickly said a prayer, then Josh bolted out of the cave to get help. Rescuers from the Utah SAR office responded to the incident. They had rescued a couple of people already from the cave, with one of them from the exact same spot, so they were confident they'd be able to rescue John. The first person on the scene was a woman named Susie Matola. By the time she crawled in there, John had been stuck for 3 hours, 30 meters or 100 feet underground. John greeted her with a weary, exhausted voice. "Hi Susie, thanks for coming, but I really want to get out of here." Over the next few hours, scores of rescuers showed up and got to work, trying everything they could to get him free. They decided to use climbing cams. They threaded a rope through the cams, strapped it to his legs, and pulled him up. While doing that, they also started drilling into the rock to widen the tunnel, but that was a very slow process. The passages were so tight that it took over an hour just to chip away a few inches of rock. That, however, was just one of the several complications. The way John had slid into the hole made things trickier. The ceiling was so low that they couldn't just pull him straight up. They had to lift him a little, adjust, and then lift him again, repeating the whole process over and over until he was totally free. There was barely any room to maneuver, and the rescuers could hardly get to him themselves. The first attempt with the climbing cams didn't cut it, so the team switched to using pulleys bolted to the cave walls, but that was another slow slog because of the narrow space. With nearly 100 rescuers working non-stop, only one person could reach John at a time, making the whole operation painstakingly dreadful and long. 19 hours into the rescue, his body was starting to break down, and frustration was mounting. He stayed as calm as he could, but the claustrophobia sometimes hit him with full-blown panic. Being trapped upside down for so long was making it hard for his heart to push blood up to his brain, and it was causing him to hallucinate. To help him cope with the agony, a two-way radio was lowered down so he could talk to his wife. Despite the dire situation, they did their best to comfort each other. After what felt like forever, the rescuers finally finished drilling and setting up the pulleys to lift him out. As they began to pull, the pain in his legs became almost unbearable, and they had to take frequent breaks. But slowly he was making progress, and hope sparked when he locked eyes with a rescuer. He was exhausted, but through the pain he managed to offer a smile. But then, just when it seemed like he was almost free, everything fell apart. The entire team yanked backward, and the rope went slack. A terrifying crash echoed through the tunnel, and dust filled the space. When it finally settled, the rescuer closest to him was knocked out, and he realized the pulley had broken free. To make matters worse, he had slipped back into the crevice even deeper than before. The pain was excruciating, but worse was the helplessness. The unconscious rescuer was replaced, and when the new one arrived, John Jones was fading. The new guy gave it all, trying to drill a hole for the pulley system or using a jackhammer to widen the hole, but sheer exhaustion got the best of him too. On top of that, the cramped space made it impossible to get a good angle of the job. Another rescuer took over, but by then, John was barely hanging on. The shadows before his eyes grew darker and darker until he couldn't see or hear anything at all, slipping into unconsciousness. Not long after, he blacked out. A medical professional crawled into the cave, checked him over, and declared him dead at midnight on November 25th of 2009. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest, and despite the relentless efforts of 137 rescuers working around the clock for 27 hours, they couldn't save John Jones from the depths of the Nutty Putty Cave. The next day, authorities decided it was too risky to try and recover the body, so with his family's consent, they poured cement over the entrance, sealing the cave for good, while John's body remains there to this day, making Nutty Putty Cave his final resting place. November 1st, 2020, a resident of Veryovkina in the Sochi district in southern Russia, 37-year-old Sergei Kozev is saying goodbye to his family, having told them he is going on the mountains to soak up some nature. It's something he does all the time, and his family's used to it. Being a mountain enthusiast, Sergei hits the trails as a hobby quite often, going on these epic expeditions that can stretch on for months. But since he loves it, that's all worth it. So doing what he always does, he gives his wife and 2 kids a quick hug and heads out in the car. It's been ages since his last trip, and he's really pumped about it. But there's a little twist to his journey that's not quite what it seems. Instead of his usual campaign, Sergei has his sights set on something a bit different this time around. Changing up his normal route, he drives his car about 15 to 20 kilometers from his hometown, across the Sao River, crossing over the Russian border, and entering Abkhazia, a disputed Georgian territory nearby. Once across, you keep driving along the coast, heading toward Gagra, a town that's pretty much the gateway to the rugged mountain regions further in. From there, the route takes climbers towards the Arabica Massif Mountains, navigating through unpaved and sometimes pretty steep roads until they finally reach the base camp. At this point, it's all on foot, where climbers trek through a wild karst landscape filled with limestone formations, sinkholes, and underground rivers, climbing to an elevation of 2,285 meters or 7,497 feet. This is where they'd come up upon a massive 3x4 meter hole in the ground, surrounded by craggy cliffs. While this might just look like another sinkhole or cave mouth among the countless craters and caverns scattered across the area, it's actually the entrance to the Veryovkina, the deepest known cave in the world, dropping a mind-boggling 2,203 meters or 7,257 feet down and stretching out 17,500 meters or 57,400 feet underground. Sergei had been eyeing this daring adventure for almost a year, but there was a catch. Most expeditions to Veryovkina are led by teams of seasoned pros under tightly controlled conditions and extreme risk management. In fact, he was inspired by a group of Russian cavers who tried to reach the bottom but were forced back by a massive flood. And despite knowing that a whole team of experts had failed, he still went ahead and decided to take on this challenge all by himself. On top of that, nobody knew he was planning to take such a dangerous mission solo. He didn't even bother getting an official permit to dive into the cave. As for experience, Sergei was a decent climber, but had only recently gotten into spelunking, with just 2 previous caving experiences under his belt and a whole lot of crazy enthusiasm, which of course wasn't nearly enough to pull off such a risky stunt. But without a clue about what was coming, Sergei geared up his camo overalls and trekking boots, tied a rope to a rocky ledge, and started lowering himself into the abyss with a lattice descender. To make getting down to the Veryovkina Cave a bit easier, spelunking groups had set up 6 camps at different depths. These spots were where cavers could take a breather before pushing on, because getting to the bottom wasn't something you could knock out in a day. Sergei had all this info, maps, terrain details, and everything else saved as screenshots on his phone, which explains his laid-back attitude about tackling the beast of a cave. The first part of the descent was mostly straight down, but after that, Sergei hit a bunch of tight, horizontal tunnels where he had to climb on his stomach or scramble over rocky obstacles before dropping down again. Eventually, he made it about 380 meters or 1,250 feet down, where he found the first camp. So far, everything had been pretty smooth sailing, so he most likely wasn't worried at all. At Camp 1, he took a break for a few hours, swapped out his wet clothes, and grabbed some food. He also found some gear that earlier expeditions had left behind, so he picked up whatever seemed useful and got ready to keep going deeper. From Camp 1, the path forward wasn't all that clear. To go deeper into the cave, he had to backtrack a bit uphill to get back on the main descent route. But once there, the descent to Camp 2 would be a bit easier than the first leg. Camp 2 had more supplies left behind, including a makeshift toilet, some cooking gas, and a bit of leftover food. The biggest lifesavers, though, were the sleeping bags. He was wiped out and needed some serious rest, so this was going to be his crash pad for the whole week, somewhere he could kick back, recharge, and figure out his next move. But with that bit of comfort came the first big red flag of this bizarre journey. His lifeline up to now, all the maps and notes he'd been gathering for a year, were stored on his phone, which was now dead, leaving him completely on his own. Ideally, he should have returned from there, but nothing about this whole trip was ideal until now, so why would this be any different? He decided to continue his journey, which was perhaps a few hundred meters away from turning into a total disaster. As he pushed onward, aiming for Camp 3, just 200 meters to go, the freezing water and plummeting temperatures started to get under his skin. That's when another major flaw in his preparations reared its head, possibly the deadliest one. Just like his experience, his gear wasn't up to the cave's extreme conditions. He was supposed to have a wetsuit to handle the freezing weather from several underground streams. But from the start, he'd been taking what's known as the most dangerous spelunking expedition a bit too casually. The temperature dropped like a rock in this part of the cave, and Sergei was getting soaked by freezing water left and right. Now, even if he wanted to turn back, he couldn't because he didn't bring any clamps or stirrups to help him climb up. His only choice was to keep going down, hoping that Camp 3 might have some gear to help him get back up or protect him from the brutal cold. What started as an exciting adventure had turned into a desperate fight for survival. Somehow making it through the toughest portion of the cave yet, Sergei finally reached Camp 3. But to his utter disappointment, there was nothing there to help him out. Panic set in, and he felt death closing in within the claustrophobic walls of the cave. At this point, he had two choices: wait around for death to catch up, or push on to Camp 4, which was 350 meters further into the cave, and hope for a miracle. He chose the latter, but as he kept ascending, the conditions only got worse. Each step downward was a battle. The air was so frigid it burned his lungs, and every breath was like inhaling shards of ice. The icy water wasn't flowing down like a waterfall anymore. It was pooling around his feet, soaking his clothes, and seeping into his skin. On top of that, his hands, already numb and shaking, struggled to hold onto the slick, wet ropes, while his muscles refused to listen to his frantic commands. He pressed on past the 1,100 meter or 3,600 foot mark, but the tight, dark tunnel of despair was closing in on him. Suddenly, his foot slipped on a loose rock. He swung wildly on the rope, slamming into the icy, jagged cave wall. From that point on, he couldn't muster the strength to regain his grip and just dangled there as hypothermia set in. Weeks passed with no sign of him, and his wife finally reported him missing. Despite a massive search effort, no one could find him. Then on August 4th of 2021, the Veryovkina club members on an expedition to Veryovkina discovered his decayed, unrecognizable body hanging from the rope 1,100 meters or 3,600 feet down in the cave. They used his phone's SIM cards to find his photos and track down his family, but since the body was in rough shape and the cave was such a death trap, it was impossible to get his remains out in one piece. So Sergei's family gave official permission for a team of about 100 cavers to cut him into manageable pieces and haul him out of the cave. Around the rugged terrains of northern Pakistan, just short of the border with China, there's a narrow, winding path that snakes through the valleys of the Karakoram range, leading to a hidden clearing. Here the giant peaks part like curtains, unveiling a vast, dramatic expanse where the air is thin and the sky seems to stretch forever. This is where the last human settlement of the region, CO.AG, marks the point beyond which normal life ceased to exist. No people, no infrastructure, and no transport. From here, the gateway opens to a brutal, icy wilderness that stretches out for a grueling 7-day trek to reach the world's most treacherous and second highest mountain, Karakoram 2, better known as K2. Climbers describe K2 as a massive, relentless pyramid of ice and jagged rocks. It earned the nickname the Savage Mountain in 1953 when American mountaineer George Bell famously remarked, "It's a savage mountain that tries to kill you." This statement remained haunting the climbers up until 2021, as for every 4 people who made it to the top, 1 would die on the way back. Though recent years have seen a slight increase in successful climbs, but that doesn't take away from the mountain's scary reputation as a total killer. Born on February 2nd of 1976, Muhammad Ali would later be known as Muhammad Ali Sadpara, named after his remote village in the far north of Pakistan. As the youngest of 11 kids, growing up at such a high altitude gave Ali more strength and endurance than most people, which would later make him fall in love with mountains. Ali's family struggled financially. His father worked a low-level government job, and with so many mouths to feed, resources were always tight. After finishing junior high in their village, Ali's father moved the family to a nearby town to give Ali a chance to continue his education. Although he was a bright student, the family's financial hardship cut that dream short. So Ali jumped into the workforce right after high school, and choosing a career was a pretty straightforward task. Sitting right at the doorstep of some of the world's highest peaks, Ali's hometown drew tons of international tourists and mountaineers eager to summit those giant mountains. But it wasn't just about trekking and climbing. Hauling all the gear up to the base camps was another big job. That's where local, young guys would make a living. They served as high-altitude porters, lugging heavy loads up the mountains for the climbers and tourists in exchange for some cash. With his impressive physique and stamina, Ali seemed like a natural fit for the job. But his tight finances made the already grueling work even more challenging. Day in and day out, Ali would carry back-breaking loads up the dangerous mountains, doubling as both a porter and a tour guide with nothing but makeshift gear and sometimes even flip-flops. Yet his exceptional fitness made it all seem easy. Expeditioners often recalled how they'd be gasping for air and struggling to keep up, while Ali would be jogging up the steep inclines and calling back to them to hurry up. As his reputation soared, so did his love for the mountains. Becoming a well-known porter in the village, he started joining extended campaigns with international teams, all while still carrying gear for them. Despite being a porter, his experience earned him respect that went beyond just his job title. Expert mountaineers from all over began looking to him as a mentor and guide, seeking his advice on crucial ascents. In 2006, Ali conquered the 13th tallest mountain in the world and his first 8,000er peak, Karakoram 2. For a bit of context, the term 8,000ers refers to the 14 mountains that top 8,000 meters, or 26,247 feet, as recognized by the International Mountaineering and Climbing Federation. Over the years, he became the only Pakistani to summit 8 of these 14 giants, with 5 of them in Pakistan. By 2016, he had set his sights on something even more extraordinary. He led a 3-man team to become the first ever to climb Nanga Parbat, the 9th highest peak in the world during the winter. Known as the Man-Eater or Killer Mountain for its sheer vertical slopes and brutal temperatures that plummet to -51 degrees Celsius, Nanga Parbat lived up to its fearsome reputation. This high-profile adventure brought Ali even more fame, stoking his relentless spirit. Over the next few years, he continued his daring expeditions, which included summiting the 4th and 5th highest mountains and climbing some 8,000er peaks multiple times, like Nanga Parbat, which he scaled 4 times over a total span of 9 years. In January of 2018, Ali joined forces with the Basque mountaineer Alex Teichen to take on Mount Everest, aiming to summit the world's highest peak without supplemental oxygen during the brutal winter season. This formidable challenge required enduring temperatures as low as -60 degrees Celsius and fierce hurricane-force winds, all while relying on their natural lung capacity. It was a long shot, and in the end, the harsh conditions forced the duo to turn back without reaching the summit. But Ali's wild and unpredictable dreams weren't about to be sidelined. Later that year, he ended up summiting K2 for the first time. Although it was a standard climb without any extraordinary risks, it didn't take him long to be ready for another one. Fast forward to 2021, with post-COVID lockdowns easing, tourism in Pakistan was starting to bounce back, and so was a deadly race in the climbing community. Just a couple of weeks into the new year, on January 16th, an international team of 10 climbers made history with the first ever winter summit of K2. While the ascent was a huge success, the return proved fatal when a Spanish climber died during the descent. This groundbreaking achievement grabbed headlines worldwide. Ali felt the heat and wanted to set a new record himself. If winter climbs were now a reality, he needed to push his limits even farther, so he set his sights on reaching the summit without supplemental oxygen, a challenge he'd attempted on Everest before, but this time, he was determined to make it happen. His chance came just a month later. An Icelandic mountaineer, John Snorri, and a Chilean climber, Juan Pablo, hired him as a porter for their K2 expedition. Seeing this as a golden opportunity, Ali decided to bring his 20-year-old son, Sajid, along for the daring adventure. It was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and he wanted his son to be part of it. Sajid was no stranger to mountaineering himself. He had already summited K2 in 2019, along several other notable peaks as well. The group grew to about 25 to 30 hikers. However, as they faced the brutal -80 degrees Celsius temperatures and the treacherous terrain, the others turned back, one by one, leaving the original 4 mountaineers to continue. After spending several days at the base camp, acclimating at around 5,000 meters or 16,400 feet, Ali and his crew finally started their summit push on February 3rd, 2021 at 4 a.m. About 7 hours later, the same day at 11 a.m., the team makes it past Camp 1, hitting an elevation of 6,000 meters, continuing their ascent with a steady pace. 7 more hours on the move, they finally reach Camp 2. It's been nearly 14 hours since they started, so they decide to call it a night and rest up at Camp 2. The day has been long and taxing, but the climbers were determined to push forward. The next morning, February 4th, 2021 at 8 a.m., after almost 15 hours of rest, they started their climb up the Black Pyramid, aiming to reach Camp 3 and hit 7,350 meters or 24,100 feet by the end of their day. Sticking to their plan, the group reaches Camp 3 about 12 hours later. Worn out from a full day of climbing, they gear up for the final push to the summit, but first they take a 4.5-hour break, resting and getting their equipment ready, knowing the toughest part of their journey is still ahead. The night changes from the 4th to February 5th, a day that would unleash the most terrifying event of their lives. Around 1 a.m., the team sets off from Camp 3 for the summit, enduring a brutal climb that could take up to 14 hours on a good day. But the weather takes a nasty turn, delaying their progress and making things even more dangerous. Still, the daring climbers would continue their ascent in extreme conditions without any supplemental oxygen. At around 8,200 meters, what should have been a 14-hour trek is dragging on, and even after 17 hours, they're still 400 meters or 1,300 feet short, stuck in the bottleneck, the most dangerous part of the mountain. Here, the steep slope can reach 60 degrees, and enormous ice blocks hang overhead, ready to crash down at any moment. As they push on, Ali's son, Sajid, starts to struggle. This is when it hits them. Coming without oxygen may not have been the best plan. Ali urges Sajid to use the emergency oxygen tank, but when Sajid tries to use it, he finds out the mask regulator is leaking. Meanwhile, Ali and the other 2 climbers keep pushing up through the bottleneck. Ali turns around and yells at Sajid to keep climbing. Sajid shouts back that the cylinder is busted and he doesn't have the strength to go on. He decides to turn back, planning to wait for them at Camp 3 after they'd returned from the summit. But in those bone-chilling winds and vast icy expanse, this would be the last time Sajid sees his father. Sajid would make it back to Camp 3, but what happened to the trio after that remains a chilling mystery. Almost 5 hours later at 10:44 p.m., worried by the radio silence from his father and the other climbers, he started climbing back up from Camp 3 to look for any sign of them. But despite his efforts, he didn't see any lights or spot any movement. That's when he knew something was terribly wrong. By the next day, February 6th of 2021, almost 16 to 18 hours after the group was last seen, it was assumed that Ali Satpara and his team were stuck somewhere near the bottleneck. A race against time began to reach them as quickly as possible. The Pakistani army launched a helicopter rescue operation, with some volunteer climbers stepping in to help search for the group. Despite terrible weather conditions, the rescue team kept searching, but after almost 2 days and 20 hours since they went missing, the mission had to be called off. Even so, volunteer climbers along with Sajid kept looking for the missing trio for the next 2 weeks. But by February 18th of 2021, 13 days later, it was obvious that even if the 3 of them hadn't died right away, there was no way they could have survived that long. That's when the rescue teams and the families of the missing climbers officially presumed Ali, John, and Juan dead. Fast forward 5 months, on July 26th of 2021, another trekking group discovered 3 bodies, believed to be those of the missing climbers on the slopes above Camp 4, about 300 meters or 980 feet below the K2 bottleneck. The bodies were blackened from severe frostbite, showing signs of a desperate struggle in their final moments. To this day, no one really knows what happened to the mountaineers, but there are some obvious assumptions. Since they were found 300 meters below their last location, it's believed they reached the summit but ran into trouble on the way down. They may have lost their way or got caught in severe weather, eventually succumbing to frostbite and hypoxia.